Welcome to Bar Talk, an ongoing podcast about beer.
Mabel, Black Label.
Glen Macnow and Joe Sixpack talk about beer, brewing it and drinking it.
Here's a beer that makes it mighty clear what taste is all about.
Join Glen and Joe as they belly up to the bar and talk about the growing world of craft brews.
With a smooth lager flavor and glorious crown, it holds in the flavor all the way down.
So, let's enjoy a few rounds of Bar Talk, the podcast.
It speaks with authority.
Well, there you go. The opening of the can, the pouring of the beer. That means it is time for another Bar Talk. I'm Glen Macnow. He's Joe Sixpack. You are listening to us either on wildfireradio.com or on iTunes at Bar Talk Podcast. We always appreciate it. And we welcome your feedback. Twitter at Bar Talk Podcast. Facebook, Bar Talk with Glen Macnow and Joe Sixpack. And to tell us what we have in store today, here is the aforementioned Joe.
The aforementioned Joe has got a pretty good show together for us today here, Glenn. We've got a real mixed bag. We're going to be talking to an attorney, Alva Mather. I think this is the first for us on the show. We're going to talk about beer laws. I mean, she knows what she's talking about with those.
All right, well, it's time for our guest on Bar Talk Podcast. And, Joe, you and I often scratch our heads as to some of the laws and rules and regs of the beer industry. You actually dug up somebody who can explain some of this to us.
Right. We needed to consult a lawyer here on beer law because you and I are constantly – it's hard to figure out beer laws in this country sometimes. So we've got Alva Mather here with us. She's a partner at Pepper Hamilton in Center City. She's a business litigator and a trial lawyer who specializes in alcohol law. Alva, welcome to Bar Talk Podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I thought law drives me to alcohol, but there you have it.
Well, that too.
So
it's a symbiotic relationship.
That's good that you found. You know, it's like with both of us, sort of taking our careers and getting into beer. You've managed to do it as an attorney too.
That's right. A lot of people are quite jealous. You know, they'll come up to me. How did you manage that? You were so smart.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about how you got into it in a minute. But you brought some beer for us.
I did.
What'd you grab?
So I brought the Flying Fish Farmhouse Summer Ale. It's sort of my favorite summer drink. So even though it's still a little bit chilly outside, I'm hopeful that we'll actually get some summertime here. So it's a really good, solid summer ale.
Good. It's been around for a while from Flying Fish here, right in Jersey here. Mm-hmm. I think it's sort of become sort of one of the area's go-to summer beers. It's very popular, and she's pouring us. I
am pouring.
So thank you very much. We got a lawyer working for us. We got to watch out if we're going to get billed.
I was going to say, just wait for the invoice.
No.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I'll just drink the bottle.
There you go, straight from the bottle. That's good. So, boy, it's nice and crisp and
really, it's a great summer beer.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as we do the show in May, it's rained for 16 days in a row, and it's about 55 degrees. So,
right.
Summer ale is just a state of mind right now.
Well, that's exactly why I picked it up.
So, Alva, how did you get into alcohol law?
I'd say it was a little bit of both happenstance and decision making on my part. So. I would say 8 or 9 years ago, 2007, however long ago that was, I was at another firm, Hangley Aaronchick, and Bill Hangley, who's the main partner there, he had done work for beer wholesalers and got a case in when I was about a kind of junior associate. Before InBev purchased Anheuser-Busch, the first phase of that was that AB became the national supplier for InBev, and they did what AB is doing and has a right to do under New Jersey law, which is to terminate their existing wholesaler relationships of the previous one. It's actually an exception in New Jersey. We're going to talk about distribution laws at some point in this podcast. And they terminated all of the New Jersey wholesalers, and we represented the wholesalers in that litigation. And, that took from about 2007. It was really something I worked on all day. I mean, it really took up all my time until about 2010. And when I came out of that, I was like, well, I looked around. I was at a point in my career, I thought, I'm a good trial lawyer, but being a general litigator is not really going to do very much for me in terms of business development. I'd come to really understand New Jersey's laws. Didn't see a lot of people in the space, and it was also a time that craft beer was really starting to move and need lawyers who understood the law. So I kind of took that experience and went out and just slowly, incrementally started educating myself, educating clients. And so at this point, I do both a mix of actual litigation, but, also just a lot of regulatory counseling and things of that nature.
Is your business skewed towards craft beer, or is there, I'm sure you're doing liquor and wine as well, but where does craft beer fit in, say, in terms of a percentage of your work?
I would say actually craft beer is probably 80%.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really? And why is that? Why is it so much?
I think because I started in beer, and so it was just logical that I know those laws the best. I also just think it's a community that I've just had more success with. I think craft distillers are kind of behind craft beer in terms of coming online and gaining some momentum. And so I think eventually I'll have more of a mix with that. I really don't do a lot actually in wine. I'm really very much like a distiller and beer lover. So that's
like
my
us.
percentage. Yes.
Indeed. So is Pennsylvania a friendly state to the people who make beer, the people who distribute beer, and the people who drink beer?
Well, I think, that's obviously a complicated question. I think it's, from a legal perspective, Pennsylvania brewers, there's some pluses and minuses. The plus is, and this is true in other states too, but not in all states. Pennsylvania allows you to, make your product. Now they've changed the brewery license so that you can sell direct to consumers out of a tap room type situation, as opposed to where it used to be, where you had to actually open a brew pub to get your beer at your brewery direct to consumers. And I think that's a real key. The ability to self-distribute for young brewers makes a difference because it lets them not get locked into a distribution contract, and also gives them the opportunity to tell their story. I think craft beer is so much about who's making it, what is their story, getting that kind of connection. And so the ability to do that is key. And I think part of why craft beer is doing well in Pennsylvania. The flip side of that, of course, are the franchise laws, which in Pennsylvania, if once you sign a distribution contract, it's very, very hard to get out of it. Basically, for all intents and purposes, it's impossible because you have to prove good cause. And, you can litigate that. Most people don't because it's not well defined. And the truth is that wholesalers, for the most part, have good resources to drag that out for years and years, and it's very costly. So most brewers, both who are here in Pennsylvania and who come into this state, I'd say that's their number one complaint.
Yeah, I hear it from brewers all the time, and I know it's become sort of a big issue in the craft brewing industry nationwide as well. Where do you see that heading? Do you see any kind of laws changing that would ease up and give a little bit more power back over to the supplier and less to the wholesaler? Well,
it's interesting. We were talking before the show that I did a panel on franchise law at the Craft Brewers Conference that was here in Philadelphia a few weeks ago. When you look at beer laws and you look at beer franchise laws, they were enacted at a time where you had more of a situation where you had your little kind of mom and pop wholesalers and just basically big beer, large supplier where, 100% or close to 100% of the product was coming from one supplier. That landscape has changed.
It's completely flipped.
It's completely flipped, and it's particularly flipped in the case of craft beer, right? Where there's been a lot of wholesaler consolidation, and craft beer, as opposed to having that one-to-one relationship, which is what the franchise laws were intended to protect. you have, one to many. You've got, wholesalers have so many SKUs at this point. It's hard to know to a certain extent. And I always encourage my clients to really dig deep when they're getting into a relationship with a wholesaler. How is your product going to be treated? There have been, sometimes they're called carve-outs or exceptions, but movements or lobbying efforts within craft beer to get some exceptions to getting out of distribution agreements. And New York passed a law a few years ago now. That was one of the first, not the only, but in that instance, if the beer at issue, the supplier at issue, takes up, is so small. I forgot exactly what the percentage is. I want to say it's like 3% or something like that. But if it's 3% or less of that wholesaler sort of total gross profit, then they can terminate the contract without good cause. However, they do still have to pay compensation to get out of it.
Well, I guess this is somewhat wonky kind of stuff that craft brewers really have to tackle all the time. From a drinking perspective, it seems to me, at least, that that Pennsylvania rules can be really screwy sometimes. We have the laws about where you can buy beer, how much, at what quantities you can buy beer. Is there any rational thought behind those rules, or are they just sort of some sort of crazy thing that happened in Harrisburg?
Well, it's interesting. I explained to other lawyers, particularly, that most laws in this country, they come sort of from a legal, historic perspective. And when you go to law school, there's, kind of key precepts. You take torts, you take contracts, and the fundamentals in those class can kind of help you understand other laws. Alcohol is completely different. It's historically based, and so the laws are written in Pennsylvania and in other states really as a historical reaction to the reality of prohibition and what people were worried about at that time. And so a lot of the nuances and just illogical things that happen in alcohol law across the spectrum, but definitely with beer, really are a result of that time in our history, the evils that we were trying to face, and also, frankly, a reality of how hard it is to change law.
Yeah,
that's the other piece of it.
So you're saying, so you go back to 1933,
right,
when Prohibition's overturned, and Pennsylvania. At the time, Harrisburg, I'm assuming the rubes from upstate say, well, wait a second, we gotta protect this. So they set up all of these laws. I didn't grow up in Pennsylvania, so I moved here as an adult and never figured out, why can't I buy a case of beer the same place I can buy a 6-pack of beer, the same place I could buy bourbon, but I can't buy it on Sunday, but at a supermarket, no, in a gas station, that all happened because when Prohibition ended, some people just wanted to make it as difficult as possible?
No, it's interesting from my perspective, right? Obviously I live in Pennsylvania, but I practice across the country. And even though we have our own nuances, alcohol law is wonky all over the place. So,
yeah, but I can go into a 7-Eleven in upstate
right.
New York and buy a 6-pack of beer.
Right. Well, I think some of that goes to Pennsylvania's decision to keep the control aspect over wine and spirits, right? Which is why we have our state store system, and to privatize beer. But in terms of it just being someone's crazy idea, but they were trying, at the time to create impediments.
They're trying to make it as hard as they could to
absolutely, and
that's
that's a social issue, right?
It's
public health.
So we're still suffering from laws that were written at a time when Al Capone was a brewer.
Absolutely, and the relationship between organized crime and brewery, or the perceived relationship of that, it goes to a lot of the precepts behind alcohol law, like what's known as tied house, which is why historically, and there are now more and more exceptions to this, a brewer cannot, at the manufacturing level, can't sell directly to the consumer. That there's got to be all these middle tiers, the wholesalers, the retailers, and that's because of the Al Capones of the world and the concern that there was too much organized crime living with alcohol.
So that's 83 years ago.
I know.
Much has changed,
exactly,
including organized crime running the liquor and beer industry. Is it now a question of entrenched economics, entrenched interests? The union has its interest to protect, and the people who the state importing it gets the tax money on it. Is it just a hidebound economic system that's real hard to move?
That's my perspective. When people ask me, do I think Pennsylvania is going to privatize?
I asked that question on the radio in 1985. Joe, you probably asked that question in the first column you ever wrote.
Yeah, maybe I'm too skeptical or even cynical about this stuff, but if it changes in my lifetime, I'll be shocked. I just never think it's. I've been hearing it forever. So.
Right. Well, but I think the answer to that, and the answer that I give is. There's too much at stake. There's too much money. There's too much interest. If you look at the lobbying efforts of all sides, the unions, the wholesalers, the brewers, the grocery stores. There's so many different interests coming in and spending a lot of money. But the other thing I think that's a problem is that legislators they have the ability to really kind of hear things in sound bites. It's harder to get them to take a deep dive. And alcohol law is complicated. It really, to understand kind of and this is why I have a job, to really understand the nuances and to think through, how change A would affect, all this different levels of constituents becomes difficult. And so I, from my perspective, I'm not a lobbyist, but obviously I'm interested in what's going to happen. I think that explains a lot of why we aren't seeing movement. And frankly, I think it's going to be incremental.
Yeah, and who lobbies for the consumers?
Well,
right.
I think that consumers
it's an issue that I think
themselves.
most people said, sure, you should be able to buy beer on Sunday at a Wawa, but the people who don't want that to happen are much more organized and willing to spend the money on it.
Right. Well, it's one thing. I do think Don, you wrote an article about this. I do think the PLCB itself is trying to modernize, right? So changing the to allow tap rooms off of a brewery license, changing from having to sell a case at a distributorship to being able to sell 12 packs. I do think the PLCB is trying to respond to the consumer, and they're also trying to respond to getting money, although they don't get it directly. But I think that's how it's going to be going for a while for us.
There is a consumer issue coming up on the horizon that I'm interested in, and that is labeling and disclosure of calories and contents in beer. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with that?
Right. So the FDA, as part of the Food Safety and Modernization Act, they are starting to and will be requiring. They keep pushing back the deadline. I think right now it's 2017 that restaurants that have 20 chains or more have to give disclosures for calories for most alcohol. Liquor and things like that are on the shelf are not are exempted, but you are going to start to see on Applebee's menus and things like that the calorie counts for any beer that they serve. So it's going to be at that level. It's not going to be at a corner store restaurant, and it's not going to be on the actual label itself for TTB.
Do you see it coming to that, to the label?
I don't think so. I think the view of the FDA is quite different than TTB. I think TTB has.
What is TTB?
So TTB is the regulatory entity that at the federal level that deals with alcohol. It's the old ATF. It's now the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. I have to think about it for a minute. Yeah. But the alcohol laws are the ones that TTB is given sort of specific jurisdiction to deal with. Certainly, though, beer is a beverage. It's a food as defined by a lot of the laws that the FDA is responsible for. And the FDA has been encroaching more than it used to into alcohol and the regulation of alcohol. So I haven't seen an appetite for TTB to change and require labels, but I think the first step is going to be what happens and what's the reaction when people start seeing it on menus.
I'm personally all for it. I think it's good disclosure. I mean, and besides that, I mean, if you do pick up a bottle of beer, it tells you what the alcohol content is.
Right. Why
not calories? Although it's funny, Glenn, TTB is also the organization that Conshohocken Brewing had its little bit of a run-in with its logo.
Run-in is not the appropriate word. Basically, being told that we couldn't use our full logo was it. And I get it. Our logo for our brewery, because we're on the bike trail and biking is a big part of our identity, was a guy on the old-fashioned bike, which
penny farthing.
Thank you very much. With a bowler hat, holding up a nice frothy beer. And we like that logo. It's on our T-shirts and it's painted in our building and it's there. But when we went to cans, you have to submit it, and they said, you're encouraging drinking and biking. That's not safe.
Right.
You got to either
lose.
Well,
that's illegal, in certain states and jurisdictions.
Got to lose the bike, or you got to lose the beer. So the man's hand of beer mysteriously disappeared on that.
What is he holding? He's the other handlebar.
You never see the other hand. You just see the one. We don't know what he's holding.
Well, that's the kind of crazy stuff that brewers will run into, and also some of these other laws we've been talking about. So you've got your work cut out for you, Alva. Well, listen, thank you for joining us here on Bar Talk Podcast. Our first lawyer, at least that I know of. We got. Can't remember if we
first one that admitted.
Yeah, exactly. There we go.
And you brought beer, Flying Fish, which is Farmhouse, which was great. And appreciate you joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.